Thank you. I now give the floor to the Commission to respond. Madam Jourová, you have the floor. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Madam President, honourable members. Thank you very much for this very important debate. I think it was very obvious from what the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said in her opening speech. No place for racism in our Union. The Commission condemns all instances of racist or xenophobic hatred and violence. But let me also be clear that we condemn violence in general, wherever it comes from, and that the police needs to do its demanding job, but always within clear limits of the law. Racial or ethnic profiling and selective approach should not be tolerated. And by the way, our Fundamental Rights Agency already published, I think 2 years ago, very useful guidelines which could serve as a training for the police and for the armed forces to avoid this kind of treatment. Yes, Black lives matter, because all lives matter. Everyone, black, white, or any other race or nationality, deserves the same chance to be able to participate and pursue happiness in our social environments. We all should be able to say to our children and grandchildren, do not worry, nobody will kill you because of the color of your skin. But this debate is also about where we are in Europe with racism and xenophobia, and we have a lot of data, for instance, from already mentioned Fundamental Rights Agency in its latest reports, which brings a clear evidence that people with minority backgrounds continue to experience harassment, violence, and ethnic and racial discrimination in different areas of life in the EU. And indeed, you said several times here, we have strong legislation, but the legislation cannot do the whole job. We have the legislation on the highest possible level. The President von der Leyen mentioned the Charter of Fundamental Rights. We have 20 years since the adoption of the Racial Equality Directive and over 10 years after the adoption of the Framework Decision on Racism and Xenophobia. So we have strong legislation, and the situation is still worrying and remains worrying. We indeed need to promote and to get adopted the Equal Treatment Directive, which was mentioned here many times. It's a shame, I would say, that this directive waits 12 years for adoption. And I fully rely on my colleague Helena Dalli, who was here still a while ago, that she will be very determined to convince the member states to take unanimous decision, because this directive requires unanimity. The legislation itself is so important, its implementation and proper enforcement. But we need much more, because what's our problem? It's deeply rooted prejudice and stereotype thinking. So we need awareness raising, we need education, we need culture, and we need equality bodies which were strengthened by our legislation in the last mandate and which should do the good job. We need trust from the people belonging to minorities to report on the cases of harassment and violence against them. They do not trust, they do not report. And now, I think next week, we will also update our strategy on implementation of the Victims' Rights Directive to encourage the victims to report. But we should do much more not to have the victims. It's late to respond only with the criminal justice. We have problems in all the member states. I would say this is pan-European problem, but country-specific symptoms. And we only have 15 member states at this moment which have the strategy against racism. We have to talk seriously about that it has to be changed. We also had to work much more with the digital world. Because we saw a lot of increase of hatred online. We have quite efficient instruments against hate speech, and we have the platforms cooperating, but we need to do much more in this direction. This year, if you know the work programme of the Commission, we want to uphold our European Charter of Fundamental Rights by adapting the strategy on Charter implementation. We will also update the strategies on Roma inclusion and LGBTI equality later this year. And if you noticed, also in the proposal of the budget, the EU New Generation budget, there is a very clear line that it must have social dimension and nobody should be lagging behind and everybody should get the chance also using the EU funding. We will have European Social Fund, hopefully well equipped also to help the minorities. We cannot trivialize the matter. This is not about political colors we are wearing, but about very basic human right, the right to be treated equally, regardless of color of skin, our religion or sexual orientation. We politicians should be put more under pressure. We politicians and opinion leaders who have the influence on what the society thinks and how the people approach the matters related to minorities. We have to refrain from spreading racially charged hatred for political gains and invest in long-term education and culture and do many more long-term measures. As Ursula von der Leyen said, I can also confirm, I don't have a clue how it feels to be Black. I have never experienced any kind of discrimination. That's why whenever I go to the member states and I speak, for instance, to the young Roma people, I always ask those who managed to study secondary school, who managed to study university. My question is, how did you manage that? Because I know that their starting line is so difficult, much more difficult than the starting line of my children or the children of many of us here. And they always tell me there were 3 moments. At some moment, I realized I do not want to live the life of my parents. I want to do something more. I want to get out of the trap of usually poverty. Poverty was the problem. And the second very important thing and condition, I needed to find the helping hand. Those who managed always found helping hand. In their local community, it was the mayor, it was the NGO, it was the teacher or director of the school. They could not manage without the help. So the zero tolerance for discrimination and zero tolerance for racism, it cannot be enough. We have to take proactive actions and support the people to get out of the trouble. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now give the floor to State Secretary Brjnac to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, honourable members. This can be a useful and emotional debate. I would like to thank you for this opportunity to participate in it. I believe that our institutions are largely on the same line with regard to these important issues. Respect for human dignity and human rights, freedom, democracy, equality and the rule of law are the very foundations of the European Union. The Council is committed to upholding these values in the EU's external relations, including with our like-minded partners such as the United States. Let me assure you once again that the Presidency and the Council as a whole rejects any form of racism and racial discrimination and supports your fight to make sure our values endure. We have a solid legal framework in place which needs to be complemented by effective implementation, enforcement and targeted measures such as education, public debate and counter-narratives. I can assure you that the Council will continue to follow this debate very closely and that I listen closely to your views today. We must hear the voice of young people peacefully, demanding a better and more justly world. Thank you very much once again for your attention.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, the debate is closed and the vote will be held on Friday. Thank you.